I just sense that pause that says that everyone thinks it's.
Well, it's right here, Dave.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out today to hear Joseph Orosco. I'm David Hildebrand. I'm a professor in the philosophy department at UCD. And the title of the talk, Professor Orosco will announce at the last moment to keep suspense high. But he's going to talk on Cesar Chavez and immigration. I want to just say a couple words about Dr. Orosco, just to let you know a little bit about who he is and where he comes from. Dr. Orosco joined Oregon State University Philosophy Department in the fall of 2001. He did his graduate work at the University of California at Riverside and his bachelor's in philosophy at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. His primary areas of research are social and political philosophy, especially democratic theory and the ethics of globalization. His research is focused on the political theory of various figures, including Josiah Royce, Martin Luther King Jr., and Cesar Chavez, and he's currently completing a book on Cesar Chavez's theory of nonviolence. He's a founding member of the Oregon State University Faculty and Staff for Peace and Justice. Is that a center?
No, it's just a rebel.
A group of some sort. He teaches classes in both philosophy and ethnic studies at OSU in Latino, Latina, and Latin American thought. He emphasizes in those classes Mexican culture, history, and immigration issues to the United States. I should just mention as a final note that this talk was co-sponsored by the philosophy department at UCD, the UCD HSC Office of Student Life, and the Hispanic Student Services. So thank you all for coming, and please won't you welcome Dr. Joseph Orosco.
Well, first let me just extend my thanks to the university for inviting me here and all the fine people that I've had the opportunity to meet. As it turns out, I know quite a few people through various kinds of channels already here, so it's sort of like coming to a place of welcome already. And thank you to the rest of you for coming to partake in this discussion today. The talk that I want to give today is entitled Pilgrimage, Penitence, and Revolution, Cesar Chavez and the Promise of Latino Immigration. And what I want to talk about in general is the idea about cultural capital, right? The idea that there might be something that we as the United States can benefit from the presence of Latino immigrants in the sense of being able to absorb certain kinds of cultural teachings and underpinnings from Mexican culture. Typically, the immigration debate, when we talk about it, is very sort of policy-driven. And while I teach social and political philosophy, I have no formal training in political science, so I don't really like to talk about policy issues. You know, what should we do here? What are the economics of immigration? How does this affect us in terms of jobs and public benefits? I'll leave that to the experts to talk about. What I'm interested more so is in what could the benefits be for our society from gaining a certain kind of cultural capital from Mexican Americans living within the United States. Are there certain kinds of moral lessons that we might be able to take from the kinds of cultural differences that Mexicans bring to the United States? And so I want to talk on that level about building what Cesar Chavez tended to call a culture of peace. So throughout the 20th century, the United States has been, its political life has been structured to respond to various kinds of external threats. In the 20th century, we battled fascism, communism, and now we are facing this war on terror. There are various figures, for instance, Samuel Huntington and Victor Davis Hanson, who want to include immigration, particularly Latino immigration to the United States, to this list of dangers that the United States faces. And one of the challenges in thinking about the threats to our society is we have to figure out how to balance the values of our public life, liberty, equality, freedom, and so forth, with this need for security. And the question is, how do we exactly meet this challenge of trying to preserve the political values that we cherish so much in the United States, with the idea that there are perhaps really serious threats to our way of life. How do we exactly balance this without losing the political life that we have? And so I think that we can turn to Cesar Chavez as a figure who begins a kind of reassessment of our political life to help guide us in thinking about what kind of America we want to live in. I think that what Cesar Chavez will give us in terms of a lesson is that Mexican immigrants to the United States are not a threat, but in fact a resource for our social justice struggles. What I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to examine the nature of this supposed threat to the United States that Mexican Americans pose. And I want to demonstrate that what I'm calling neo-nativists, folks like Samuel Huntington and Victor Davis Hanson, are simply repeating ethnocentric arguments against Mexican immigrants that have been extended in the United States for almost close to a century. So the debates about immigration are nothing new, and in fact are part of a very long history against Mexico, and I sort of just want to hint at that a little bit to put that in context. What I want to show is that Cesar Chavez believed that the growing Latino population in the United States would herald great shifts in our society. And some of Chavez's remarks could be interpreted to say that he thought that Latinos would form an important political bloc with its own special interests. And this is precisely the kind of thing that worries many of the neo-nativists who believe that if Latinos develop their own political interests in the United States, this is going to divide us into an Anglo and a Latin America. I think that if this is Chavez's view, if this is really what Chavez was hoping for, this creation of this Latino bloc, then he and the neo-nativists are simply wrong about the presence of Latinos in the United States. I want to show that, in fact, Latinos are increasingly integrating and not separating their political interests into the American mainstream. But I think that the more important thing to take about Chavez is his remarks about the influence of Latino immigration in a different way. That the Latino community in the United States represents an opportunity to re-examine the values of American society that he believed were dedicated to military strength and corporate dominance. So I want to demonstrate how Chavez worked to develop a broad-based social movement grounded in Mexican folk culture and history to initiate this re-examination of our life. Chavez hoped that the strong presence of Latinos in the United States could help in the cultivation of a culture of peace and provide nonviolent alternatives within the American society, and hopefully that this kind of emphasis on a culture of peace can help us balance our needs for liberty and freedom, preserving these civil liberties, and the need for security. So I want to begin talking about the neo-nativist resurgence that we've seen in perhaps the past 10 years in the United States. Now, Samuel Huntington, a figure who many of you may be familiar with, argues that Mexican immigration represents a major threat to the United States that is on par with the threat of terrorism posed by, quote, religiously driven militant Islam. For Huntington, Mexican immigrants could affect a consolidation of Mexican-dominant areas into an autonomous, culturally and linguistically distinct, economically self-reliant bloc within the United States. And he believes that such a bloc would destabilize American politics. Such a bloc would be harmful, he thinks, because he believes that, quote, profound differences exist between Mexican and American values and culture. For Huntington, American culture is defined by its adherence to what he calls, quote, the Christian religion, Protestant values and moralism, a work ethic, the English language, British traditions of law, justice, and the limits of government power, and a legacy of European art, literature, philosophy, and music, close quote. On the other hand, he thinks that Mexican culture is defined by its Catholicism and its various central Hispanic traits that he believes include, quote, a mistrust of people outside the family, a lack of initiative, self-reliance and ambition, low priority for education, and an acceptance of poverty as a virtue necessary for entrance into heaven, close quote. Now, he never exactly explains where he gets this characterization in the book where he talks about this, and this book is loaded with various kinds of stereotypes, as we'll see. But at least he believes that there's a strong sort of religious difference that's grounded in the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism, between Anglo and Latino America. The cultures of these two societies are not only irreconcilable, according to Huntington, but Mexican cultural norms actually inhibit the educational, political, and economic success of immigrants. He cites anecdotal testimony of a third-generation Mexican-American in Tucson who claims that in his community, no one is interested in education or in hard work. Allowing Mexican norms and values to flourish within the United States would therefore, according to Huntington, mean its eventual decay from within. This corrosion of public life is already visible, according to Victor Davis Hanson. We already see the effects of this decay in our cities. For Hanson, illegal Latino immigration in California is associated with rising crime, gang violence, disregard for private property, and an enormous drain on public services. So for both Huntington and Hanson, they argue for restrictions against Latino immigration, and they focus on acculturating Latinos into Anglo-Protestant American values, because otherwise we're going to create these separatist blocs that are going to be hotbeds of these kinds of morally decadent traits, and eventually the kinds of values that we take for granted, liberty and freedom and so forth, will erode in our political life. And so this is something that, according to these figures, we want to try to avoid. Now, such characterizations of Mexicans and Mexican immigrants by American intellectuals and political leaders are certainly not new features of American public life. And they are certainly not occasioned by the sudden influx of Mexicans into the United States in the latter part of the 20th century. So for Huntington, a lot of these problems, there's a sort of kind of apocalyptic tone to his work, is that something is happening now that has never happened in our history before, and if we don't do something now, then we're going to hit a breaking point, and our society will no longer be able to absorb all of these immigrants, and it's all going to come apart. But I think that if we look, just at sort of cursory history of relationships between the United States and Mexico, and we look at the way in which newspapers and public intellectuals have looked upon Mexico, we realize that these arguments are not anything new or original or, in fact, unique. So shortly after the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, major newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, conjured up a brown scare, which in fact you hear in various places today along this tone. So in 1913, the LA Times ran articles claiming that Mexicans were hoarding weapons along the border in order to raid American cities and towns. And according to the LA Times, Mexicans were, quote, frantic for a desire to loot and pillage, and would suffer, quote, no pangs of conscience if, drunk with some success, they should mistake an American home or bank for Mexican property, or mistake an American miss for a Mexican maid. Right, so the idea essentially here is that Mexicans along the border are essentially greedy for American property, and they're also rapists. Right, so we need to be afraid of what we see along the border. And of course, this fuels the images that we have of border towns like Juarez and Tijuana as places of vice and sin and violence in various ways. And this is played out in American pop culture in many, many different ways. American intellectuals also got into this game, including this testimony by a professor of economics from Vanderbilt in 1921 before Congress. Professor Roy Garris was a proponent of eugenics, and he believed that there were dangerous core cultural traits amongst Mexicans that originated from within their indigenous heritage that made them particularly dangerous. And according to his testimony, and this was right before, this was testimony to restrict immigration into the United States in the 1920s, Garris testified saying, they seem to be men of few wants, apathetic, without ambition, not concerned with the future. Rarely do they own land. They are improvident and prefer to work intermittently, getting into debt with their employers, who thereby are enabled to hold them to their estates. They are much given to drinking pulque, an intoxicating liquor. Close quote. These characteristics made them undesirable immigrants because of the possibility of these genes making their way into the American population and corroding civic life. So Garris concluded, quote, we can search in vain throughout the countries of Europe for biological, economic, and social conditions fraught with a fraction of the danger inherent in the immigration of Mexicans into the United States, close quote. And after the start of the Great Depression, American officials began campaigns to deport Mexican immigrants that culminated in 1931 in the forced removal of almost 500,000 Mexican and Mexican-American immigrants and natural-born citizens. The justifications for these sweeps at the time echo Huntington and Hanson's descriptions of Mexican immigrants and their descendants in the U.S. today. At the time of these deportations, Secretary of Labor William Doak argued that the deportations were necessary because many of the immigrants were illegal, and he was appointed to uphold the rule of the law. And we hear this from our public officials all the time. Secretary of Labor Doak said, quote, "Law is law, and I intend to enforce it as long as I hold my office," close quote. Texas Governor James Ferguson warned that, quote, "The Mexican people have not improved one bit in civilization," close quote. And he believed that the creation of enclaves in Texas just simply reinforced their aversion to assimilate into American life and become American citizens. And so I think this idea that Mexican immigration is a threat, whether economic, social, biological, or cultural, is not a new one in our history. Huntington's and Hanson's neo-nativism is part of a consistent attitude by American officials and public intellectuals against Mexican immigrants for almost a century now. Such tendencies seem to heighten during periods of more concentrated immigration, as we're seeing in the past, say, 15 years or so. And they also seem to heighten during periods of national crisis, as we've seen in the past 7 years or so. And then they ebb in better economic times, but they are a constant feature of America's troubled relationship with its neighbor to the south. So in some sense, this kind of worry about what we're going to do with Mexico is part of, in some sense, American culture. We've always had this kind of attitude towards Mexico, that it's a troubled place that we need to do something about. If not, they're going to do something really awful to our culture, to our genes, to our political life. So, given all of this, there have been many different kinds of intellectuals in American public life who have said that if we want to rejuvenate Mexican, or that is, if we want to rejuvenate American struggles for justice, for more political liberty and so forth, then maybe we need to pay attention to immigrant cultures. And so at the turn of the 20th century, there were various philosophers. I'm thinking here of Josiah Royce, Jane Addams, John Dewey, and other folks who said that if we want to build a better political democracy in our country, then we need to see what kinds of resources, and not just simply labor resources, but philosophical resources, moral resources, cultural resources that we can learn from the immigrants that live within our urban areas. And so I take Cesar Chavez to be thinking along these lines ultimately. And so what I want to do is now switch to Cesar Chavez and his assessment of what potential Mexican immigration to the United States had. So in the last decades of his life, Chavez campaigned around California for a variety of issues that were not directly related to farm labor. For instance, in 1984, he spoke out against Proposition 39, which was a ballot initiative that would have redrawn state legislative districts. In 1991, he tried to rally supporters to defeat another proposal, Proposition 98, that would have cut budgets for public education and state services. Now, in both cases, Chavez argued that conservative politicians and corporate leaders were attempting to consolidate their power against a historical inevitability. Each initiative was an effort to diminish the political and educational power of the growing Latino population, either by fragmenting it into many different representative districts or by impoverishing the public schools where many Latino children went to school. And so he reminded his listeners that these proposals for budget cuts in public education came at the same time as prisons were flourishing in California. And Cesar Chavez writes, "What message do these kinds of priorities send? Does this mean that the only way our sons and daughters can get recognition from the state of California is by using drugs and committing crimes?" Close quote. So Chavez tried to speak out prophetically against these trends. And so he says again, quote, "The farm workers and their children, and the Hispanics and their children are the future of California. Those politicians who ally themselves with the corporate growers against the farm workers and the Hispanics are in for a big surprise," close quote. So Chavez believed that within 20 or 30 years, Central Californian communities would undergo a dramatic demographic change. Latino farm workers and their families would be the ethnic majority, and politicians and business leaders would have to learn to cater to the needs and interests of these people, their new constituents. These leaders would also have to compete with the descendants of farm workers who would become the new doctors, lawyers, and political elites. And so Chavez writes, quote, "Why do they want to cut funds for schools and other vital services? Why now? Why do Governor Wilson and his allies seek to reduce the commitment to public education now? If the majority of children in schools were white, and if they lived in affluent suburban communities, we wouldn't even be debating how much money to spend on public education. but it is our children, the children of farm workers and Hispanics and other minorities who are seeking a better life. The 1990s saw the awakening of what many political observers termed the sleeping dragon, the Latino electorate that Chavez thought was going to be coming in California. The anti-immigrant fervor that was initiated in California by the passing of Proposition 187 in 1984 led to an unprecedented surge in single-nation naturalization rates. In 1997 alone, some close to 300,000 Mexicans became citizens and many registered to vote. In the 2000 presidential election, all major candidates courted Latinos. They realized that Latinos tend to be concentrated in the states of California, Texas, Florida, and New York, all of which are key to winning the Electoral College. And by 2004, it was clear that Latinos could play a decisive role in many prominent races. 2 Latinos were elected to the U.S. Senate, one of them from here. Right? And shortly afterwards, Antonio Villaraigosa became the first Latino mayor of America's second largest city in almost 150 years. So Chavez expected some drastic changes that would result of these political developments. He hoped that the growing Latino electorate would develop its own political will and clout, and it would resist attempts by conservative politicians and corporate leaders to downsize public services. But it's clear that in this assumption that Latinos are going to have this kind of clout and sort of take over American politics, I think it's clear that this assumption by him is mistaken. Latinos are not becoming a monolithic liberal power bloc that threatens to break away from mainstream American society. Studies indicate that Latino voters mirror the mainstream American voters in what they consider to be important political issues and what candidates to follow. More importantly, returns from the 2004 elections indicate that Latinos as a whole can no longer be taken for granted as a Democratic Party constituency. Instead, they are now a crucial swing bloc that might easily tip a race from one candidate to another, from one party to another. Latinos are developing some political clout, but they're not necessarily developing political and economic priorities that are distinct from the rest of American voters. Indeed, the massive demonstrations for immigration reform in the spring of 2006 in most American cities seem to confirm this trend. Latino immigrants marched, some by the hundreds of thousands in certain places like Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, Denver, Houston, Washington, D.C., and Phoenix. But they weren't necessarily marching for the right to maintain ethnic enclaves or to preserve their culture within the United States. Instead, many carried signs that read, quote, "I believe in the American dream," close quote, and "We are America," demonstrating a commitment to the idea of the United States as a democratic land of opportunity to which they wish to participate and contribute in a legally recognized manner. So despite the anxieties of neo-nativists and the apparent hopes of Chavez, many Latinos seem to want to become more rather than less like other American citizens. And this is also confirmed in many other sorts of studies about, for instance, language acquisition. Right? One of the big arguments that Huntington has is that if we allow this constant influx of Latinos, that Spanish will become a language of trade. And if you go, for instance, he says, to Miami, you can't find anyone that speaks English. But the reality is that's only true amongst recent immigrants, and the longer that people are here, the more English becomes a dominant language, so that by the third generation, people are usually either fully bilingual in Spanish and English, or they're fully English dominant. Right? So this idea that ethnic enclaves are going to pop up all over the place seems to be mistaken. So, if Chavez is wrong about the political clout of Latinos being able to resist Republican politicians and so forth, was he right in anything in terms of his prophecies about what Latinos would bring to the United States? I think that it's important to understand that what was important for him was not simply the development of a Latino political class, but the preservation of the values of what he called la causa, right, the farm worker struggle. The task then is not simply to get brown faces into positions of power, but to preserve the momentum of la causa and to make sure that the Latino community and its future leaders understand the accomplishments of this struggle, the farm worker struggle. And so Chavez says, regardless of what the future holds for the United Farm Workers, regardless of what the future holds for farm workers, our accomplishments cannot be undone. La causa, our cause, doesn't have to be experienced twice. The consciousness and pride that were raised by our union are alive and thriving inside millions of young Hispanics who will never work on a farm again, close quote. So this idea, I think, mirrors some of the remarks that Martin Luther King made during the Civil Rights Movement. Right? Part of what he believed was that there were many different kinds of accomplishments that were made in terms of desegregating the South and providing for civil rights for African Americans. But often he said that some of the most important work that was actually done was teaching African Americans to stand up for themselves, to develop a sense of agency. And that kind of agency was something that could never be taken away from him. He has this one anecdote. He says that once you teach a person to stand upright and no longer be bent, that person can never be oppressed again. Because once you are no longer bent over, the man can't ride you anymore. Right? And so for Chavez, I believe that the La Causa had raised the awareness of Latinos in the United States as to their own social agency. And this is the legacy, I think, that he hoped that Latinos would preserve. And he writes, this is Chavez, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. Close quote. So, I think it would be better to think about Chavez as not hoping that there would be this Latino political class, but what he hoped was that somehow there would be a kind of cultural change that would preserve the values that seemed to be generated out of the social movement that was the United Farm Workers. And I think that what I like to call this the culture of peace. He was hoping that the United Farm Workers could be a model for developing this kind of cultural catalyst that would spread in the United States. And what I mean by a culture of peace is this. I follow the United Nations Economic, Social, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, as defining a culture of peace this way. A culture of peace is a set of values, attitudes, modes of behavior, and ways of life that reject violence and prevent conflicts by tackling their root causes and solving problems through dialogue and negotiation amongst individuals, groups, and nations. So we can see this kind of trend in Chavez's thoughts, beginning in about 1971. Right? Many people don't know this particular aspect of Chavez. He was not only the farm labor organizer, but he also started to speak out against the Vietnam War, much in the same way that Dr. King had at that same time. So in the speech called the Exposition Park speech, delivered in 1971, Chavez described La Causa as a nonviolent social movement designed to counter the influence of militarism and corporate greed in the United States. He had decided to speak out against the conflict in Vietnam because to him it demonstrated how deeply American culture associates violence with power, with strength, and with authority. Young men, he wrote, had been taught that, quote, in order to be fully men, to gain respect from other men, and to have their way in the world, they have to take up a gun and use brute force against other men, close quote. Chavez pointed out the numerous ways in which violence is portrayed as an acceptable way to settle disputes and implement decisions. He thought everywhere you can see police and security forces using guns to enforce their wills, television glorifies violence and war, and men and women batter their children and one another in the home. He believed most of us honor violence in some way or another. So the task of La Causa as a nonviolent social movement was to show an alternative way to think about self-fulfillment and strength. And so he writes, if we provide alternatives for our young people out of the way we use the energies and resources of our own lives, perhaps fewer and fewer of them will seek their manhood in affluence or in war. Perhaps we can bring the day when children will learn from the earliest days that being fully man and fully woman means to give one's life to the liberation of the brother who suffers. Close quote. So Chavez thought of the United Farm Workers and the farm worker struggle as a kind of nonviolent army that could instill in young people the hard work, discipline, and sacrifice that attracted so many of them to the military. But instead of having them to do what he called battle against other poor people, the Union would focus the sacrifice of young people, quote, against the causes of their own poverty, close quote, turning their sacrifices and their suffering into a powerful campaign for dignity and for justice. So, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what were the moral resources of this campaign of La Causa. Where did La Causa get its moral viewpoints from? And I think it's clear that Chavez said that it came from his mother and her Mexican folk traditions. Chavez always emphasized that his formative understanding of nonviolence stemmed not from reading Gandhi or Thoreau, even though he did, right? But it came from Mexican folk traditions that he learned from his mother. In his eulogy for her, he explained how Juana Estrada Chavez had instructed him in nonviolence through the use of dichos, or folk sayings that encapsulated wisdom about conflict resolution. And so in his eulogy to his mother, he writes, "She taught her children to reject that part of her culture which too often tells its young men that you're not a man if you don't fight back. She would say, no, it's best to turn the other cheek. God gave you senses like eyes and mind and tongue, and you can get out of anything. It takes two to fight. One can't do it alone." Close quote. Chavez's mother also taught her children to sacrifice their time and to serve others. And so when the family was working as migrant farm workers in Delano, California in the 1940s, Juana Estrada Chavez would have her children drive fellow farm workers on errands or to the doctor. And each year, on one special day, the day of her saint, she would go out and have the boys round up homeless people in Delano and bring them to her home. She would serve them a meal. And she believed that this was part of the idea of offering assistance to the poor. So Chavez's childhood was suffused with Mexican cultural and spiritual ideas, that it's careful consideration, reason, and dialogue. These things are alternatives to violence, and that a good life, the fulfillment of human life, is one that's devoted to serving the needs of the poor and the unfortunate in your community. So in some of the earliest documents of the farm worker movement, Chavez explains how these Mexican cultural values were institutionalized as parts of the United Farm Workers and their struggle. And so what I do in my book, talking about Chavez, is I try to say that what he did was he took these cultural traits and he built them into aspects of the struggle itself and made them teaching tools for learning how to struggle for social justice in the United States. But they were firmly rooted in Mexican cultural traditions. And so I call this the logic of nonviolence that he developed. He developed various kinds of ways of thinking and patterns that would organize the tactics, strategy, and goals of a nonviolent campaign. But all of these ideas that were the foundation for this logic of nonviolence come from Mexican folk traditions. And we can see how he built these in by just looking at the motto of the 1966 Sacramento March. The Farm Worker March to Sacramento was modeled on the Freedom March from from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965 that eventually put pressure on the federal government to pass the Important Voting Rights Act in 1965. So this idea of the Sacramento March was farm workers went on this 300-mile walk from Delano to the state capital in Sacramento to push for farm worker rights before the state legislature. And so Chavez called the trek a religious pilgrimage, and he added a slightly different emphasis onto it. A pilgrimage, he writes, is a trip made with sacrifice and hardship as an expression of penance and a commitment, and often involving a petition to the patron of the pilgrimage for some sincerely sought benefit of body or of soul, close quote. So this practice of pilgrimage for Mexicans is very, very common. In fact, I remember my grandmother making a yearly pilgrimage on her knees for about 2 or 3 miles to the local church. She was a 70-year-old woman, but this was something important for her to do, was to do this pilgrimage to pray on her saint's day. And so Chavez believed that this was something that was deeply rooted in Mexican culture, the idea of the pilgrimage. People flock in major shrines all over Mexico, especially to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, sometimes on their hands and knees for miles and miles and miles, looking for assistance and intercession from the saints and the Virgin Mary. So the idea of the Sacramento March was to give people a kind of a sense of that pilgrimage. And so they engaged in this 300-mile trek, hopefully that would benefit their lives, and he hoped that they would bring that spirit of the sacrifice to the journey. So along the way of this 300-mile march in 1966, they would have Mass, and they carried religious symbols with them, namely flags of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Amid all of these professions of faith, there was also political education. Luis Valdez, who at the time was the head of the Teatro Campesino, the farm workers theater group, put on short skits during the march that taught the farm workers about labor issues and about activism. So the March to Sacramento, therefore, combined the idea of a pilgrim's journey to a site of power with the tradition of American protest demonstration in such a way that it encouraged Latino farm workers to feel welcome, and it transformed them in the meantime into organizers. So as Luis Valdez reported, the rich religious symbolism enticed thousands of farm workers to join the march. But once they were there, they received political education. So in some sense, Chavez was very adept at this. He took the idea, the cultural idea of pilgrimage, and he changed it to the American circumstance. And so this tradition welcomed many people into the movement. But while they were there, they became political agents in a sense. And so by the time that they were able to get to Sacramento a week later, they had a sense of their own power. They had a sense that they were able to accomplish something together. So this is part of the first part of the title, pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is part of that Mexican cultural tradition that he built into the idea of a nonviolent struggle. The second idea, of course, is penitence. The Sacramento March was designed to evoke the image of a Lenten penitential procession, and these kinds of things take place all over in Mexico and in Mexican-American communities before Easter. In the Lenten procession, penitents usually reenact the final passion of Christ, from the Last Supper to the carrying of the cross to Golgotha. And in some Mexican communities, these passion plays are hundreds of years old, and there's huge pageantry built up around them. According to Chavez's understanding of these rituals, he writes, penitentes would march through the streets, often in sackcloth and ashes, some even carrying crosses as a sign of penance for their sins and a plea for the mercy of God, close quote. So besides evoking the cultural symbolism of the procession, Chavez intended this Sacramento March to be a time for farm workers and other marchers to model the penitent and to suffer from fatigue, heat, and thirst in order to induce self-reflection. He wanted the farm workers who were going to be going along this march to examine their motives and their reasons for participating in this struggle. And he wanted to purify them of any feelings of anger, resentment, or revenge. Both Gandhi and Martin Luther King considered penance and purifications as essential stages in their strategies for nonviolent resistance. In fact, in order to participate in many of Martin Luther King's marches, there was an entire sort of nonviolent training that you had to go through. And one of the stages of this included sitting down and asking yourself, why exactly do I want to march? Am I prepared to accept being beaten? Am I prepared to accept blows and not return them? And for Dr. King, it was very important for people to be very self-conscious about why they were going to be going on a demonstration. And if they weren't prepared to accept that nonviolence, he didn't want them, no matter how many bodies that would add to the demonstration. And so this idea of purification, of making sure that your motives for nonviolence are pure, was very strong for all these figures in nonviolent theory. Protesters have to learn how to react appropriately to the institutionalized violence that their civil disobedience might unleash. Chavez later used this idea of suffering to explain the meaning of the fasts that he became known for. Almost 2 years after the farm workers marched in Sacramento, the Delano grape strike was going on without any resolution in sight. And in fact, the grape strike that started in Delano went on for close to about 8 to 10 years. It was one of the longest labor strikes in U.S. history. And for many of these years, farm workers were out of work. They didn't have any income, and they were constantly being told, wait, we're almost winning. Keep holding on. And many people were quite frustrated with this. And so in about 1968, some of the farm workers said, look, the growers aren't paying attention to us. We need to take some real direct action. Maybe if we burn a few barns, maybe if we destroy a few fields, they'll see how powerful we are, and they'll pay attention to us, and they'll sign a labor contract with us. And so Cesar Chavez heard about this, and he was quite angry with this idea. And so a few days after he heard about some of these rumors that some of the farm workers wanted to engage in property destruction, he announced that he would go on a fast that would eventually go on for 25 days. And in a statement at the end of the fast, he made it clear that his action had not been a hunger strike meant to pressure the growers. The fast, he said, was a personal act of penance with which he hoped to clear his mind and to gain better focus on how to better manage the organizing campaign. He also intended it to be a symbol to remind the farm workers that the essence of La Causa lay in the virtue of self-sacrifice for a greater good. Violence could possibly get them a contract, but Chavez was convinced that achieving the contract through property destruction or through threats of violence against the growers would simply contradict the ethical and cultural underpinnings of La Causa, particularly this idea of self-sacrifice. And he tried to constantly tell them that, look, what we're fighting here is to try to alleviate suffering by eliminating a system of exploitation that's maintained by agribusiness. As he put it in the Good Friday letter that he wrote in 1969 to a California agribusiness consortium, he writes, "We are men locked in a death struggle against man's inhumanity to man in the industry that you represent," close quote. Using violence, however, would simply involve trying to inflict suffering on the growers in order for them to come back and be able to negotiate. And Chavez did not see how the suffering of the farm workers justified the suffering of the growers in any sense. In his view, the point of the struggle altogether, the point of La Causa, was not to inflict more suffering or to introduce more suffering into the world, but to eliminate unjust conditions that create suffering in the first place. And so he explained in this Good Friday letter, Chavez that is, "I repeat to you the principle enunciated to the membership at the start of the fast. If to build our union required the deliberate taking of life, either the life of a grower or his child, or the life of a farm worker or his child, then I choose not to see this union built at all." Close quote. So by intimidating the growers, the farm workers could possibly get what they wanted, but this would go against what Chavez really believed was this kind of Mexican notion that we need to sacrifice some of ourselves to accomplish this kind of greater good. According to Chavez, the idea of enduring suffering is something deeply rooted in our traditions, and Dolores Huerta, the vice president of the UFW, confirmed this point. She says, "I know it's hard for people who are not Mexican to understand, but this is part of the Mexican culture, the penance, the whole idea of suffering for something, of self-inflicted punishment. It's a tradition of very long standing." And in fact, it's so long standing, it goes back for centuries to Mayan and Aztec culture. There's, in those cultures, those part of the indigenous heritage of Latin America, there are all these kinds of rituals of bloodletting, the idea that you have to perform various kinds of what's called auto-sacrificing in order to gain vision and clarity about what the universe expects from you. And this explains the idea of the human sacrifice, that many of the Europeans, when they came and saw this, considered it to be such a barbaric practice. But understanding it in the context of the worldview of the indigenous people, this kind of suffering, and often there was also self-suffering, had to be done in order to understand how the world worked in the first place. So the purposes of Chavez's penitential suffering was not to coerce others to act. Right? He was not engaging in a hunger strike, hoping to tell people, look, you do something for me or else I'm going to starve myself to death. The idea was to create a kind of symbol of suffering. And the view of this was to accentuate the injustice that was experienced by the farm workers and to prick the conscience of the public so that they could, like the Mayans, see the injustice in a new way and be moved to act on behalf of the farm workers. So as Chavez said in a statement ending his second major fast in 1972, he writes, "So long as we are willing to sacrifice for that cause, so long as we persist in nonviolence and work to spread the message of our struggle, then millions of people around the world will respond from their hearts, will support our efforts, and in the end, we will overcome." Close quote. So in the interest of time, I want to move to the last section, the last part of the logic of nonviolence. Right? We've covered so far pilgrimage, the idea of building a struggle built on this idea of a trek to a journey of power. The idea of penitence, the idea that what we need to figure out is how to use suffering in a creative way to bring people's awareness to issues more broadly. The final part of the logic of nonviolence for Cesar Chavez was the idea of revolution. So he did not deny that there was this kind of radical edge to La Causa. He writes, "The revolutions of Mexico were primarily uprisings of the poor, fighting for bread and dignity. The Mexican American," Chavez says, "is also a child of revolution." So El Plan de Deleno, the manifesto that was issued during the Sacramento March by Chavez and Luis Valdez, argues that La Causa is actually a continuation of the struggles that were started in 1910 with the Mexican Revolution. But it made very clear that the Mexican-American Revolution in the United States was going to be, and had to be, a nonviolent one. Right? They write, "Our revolution will not be armed, but we want the existing social order to dissolve. We want a new social order," close quote. And so the plan itself made reference to Mexican revolutionary plans by Emiliano Zapata, calling for indigenous land reform and so forth. And similarly, the Plan de Deleno by Cesar Chavez beckoned political groups to put an end to an unjust system that existed in California for at least half a century, subjecting farm workers to starvation wages, contractors, forced migration, illiteracy, and subhuman conditions. But I think what perhaps is most revolutionary is how this plan connects the situation of farm workers to the institutionalized oppression of other marginalized groups, So Chavez writes in the Plan de Delano, "We know that the poverty of the Mexican or Filipino worker in California is the same as that of all farm workers across the country. The Negroes, the poor whites, the Puerto Ricans, Japanese, Arabians, in short, all of the races that comprise the oppressed minorities of the United States. So the subjugation of Mexican farm workers was not a special historical circumstance, but one that extended throughout all of society and affecting other social and economic groups. And it was the result of a systematic imbalance of power in American society that he believed was created to satisfy the greed of a few elites in our country." So just a few years later, Chavez expanded this critique of American society, pointing out that the exploitation of farm workers was a worldwide phenomenon. He admitted to dreaming of building a global union that would resist an international capitalist system predicated on the idea of cheap labor. And towards the end of his life, the UFW was trying to develop ties with Mexican labor unions and social service providers, hoping to build this kind of transnational organization that would address social justice issues on a global scale. So while I think while Cesar Chavez was not a social theorist and he wasn't a grand sort of revolutionary on some major scale, it's clear that he was trying to develop a revolutionary outlook that saw injustice and suffering as the result of historic structural imbalances of power within the international political and economic institutions that run our lives. And he was trying to think about ways to develop an organizing campaign to resist and dismantle the ability of these institutions to dominate our lives. And so I think that overall Chavez's political strategy may be reformist. He never called for the violent overthrow of this or that, and in some sense he never really called for a revolution that would abolish capitalism. But he did have hopes that La Causa would instigate a revolutionary cultural change within our society. He hopes that the militant nonviolence of the farm workers, built on a foundation of Mexican values and traditions, will model alternatives for an American society that's saturated with images of violence and with greed. For Chavez, the grandest legacy of La Causa will be as a contribution toward the development of a culture of peace that can work toward a better world. He knew that this was going to be difficult work, this building of the culture of peace. After all, most Americans associate Mexico, particularly these border regions, with crime, random violence, drug trafficking, political corruption, and not with a commitment to peace and justice. Many of these stereotypes have been heightened since September 11th, 2001, with many neo-nativist voices warning that the U.S. border with Mexico ought to be thought as the first front on the war on terror. And of course, Chavez did not think that Mexican or Chicano culture are completely nonviolent. In fact, he thought that Chicano culture had to deal with various kinds of hierarchical ways of thinking, particularly its machismo, the ways in which it values the contribution of women to public life. However, Chavez did think that there were rich resources within the Mexican traditions of pilgrimage, penitence, revolutionary organizing that could be distilled into organizing principles of a logic of nonviolence for a campaign dedicated to social justice. And I think this kind of philosophy today might be useful for all Americans to think about in order to energize and guide the struggle for social justice and to maintain the security, stability, and the vitality of American democracy that I think we all want to cherish and to maintain. So, thank you very much.
We have some time for questions and comments. There's a microphone in the center if you would like. Do you want to just choose your own?
Sure, I'll field.
Yeah.
I have a question, but I'm not sure. Should I speak from the microphone?
I don't know if everybody can hear you.
So I really appreciate this contextualizing of this immigration debate, especially reminding everybody that these sort of attacks from Huntington and even our own former governor, Dick Lamb, were really not anything new, and these are really much longer historical days. And I'm struck, and your talk reminds me that so much of what we talk about in immigration is really a battle over symbols, right? That the policy simply reflects whoever dominates the discourse and the symbols they're able to play about immigrants. So, this is a real battle over symbols, who can control the discourse, what do immigrants mean, and the policy simply follows. And we've simply entered into a phase where conservatives have dominated the discourse and they're able to construct restrictive policy out of that symbol. And I'm wondering to what degree Chavez was playing into that. That is, he's a savvy politician in some respects, right? What he's offering us in terms of very counter set of symbols, certainly rooted in like Mexican culture, but is this also somehow part of a more strategic plan on his part to give people a kind of counter set of symbols that could be used then to create an affirmative policy? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah.
How much of this is organic and how much of this is manufactured on his part?
Well, I
Can you
think
repeat the question a little bit, because the people in the back are indicating.
okay, hear anything, okay. The idea, the question was whether or not the kinds of the ideas that Cesar Chavez had in terms of building up this idea of a logic of nonviolence, that this is really part of perhaps a battle of symbols that go on in the immigration debate, talking about who controls the language and the ideas of what Mexican immigration amounts to. Is this correct, Dana? And whether or not this, the kinds of things that Cesar Chavez was talking about were really where he was trying to cultivate these ideas, or whether this was sort of a strategic kind of planning and picking and trying to develop a political platform for certain kinds of political ideals. I think it's very clear that, you know, as you pointed out, Cesar Chavez was very savvy political politician, and so he knew how to engage in political organizing. And in fact, he wasn't so much very interested in demonstrations and organizing and mobilizing people to go out into the streets, unless there was a very sort of concentrated effort to make sure that you had access to the channels of power at the same time. And I think that, you know, as a matter of fact, as we've been talking about, I think that part of what Cesar Chavez would say, for instance, about the immigration marches that took place last year, was that they were very spectacular. And in fact, I participated in some of them. In fact, if you've seen some of these posters of me sitting with a bullhorn, that's what I was doing at the time. But as I was pointing out to people, I'm not quite so militant as that, you know, organizing the masses, because what you can't see in that photograph is I'm holding a bullhorn in one hand and I'm carrying my chihuahua in the other hand. Right? So my image is not quite perhaps as revolutionary as some might have thought. But I think that the idea for Chavez was that we need to figure out ways that we organize people, bring them into the movement. And so it's important to have that kind of mass mobilization. And so the cultural symbols and these kinds of things bring people. So the idea of the pilgrimage was to bring people to something that they were familiar with, this idea of going to church perhaps once a year. But in the meantime, the idea is to not just cater to that kind of symbolism, but also to bring into it the idea of the civil rights movement, the political education, training people to be political agents. And so to try to get people to recognize their own agency so that they know then that when they have an agenda, they know where to go in order to execute it. And so part of the idea was we get people in, we drag them in, and we take notice of this kind of cultural nationalism. Right? Chavez was not a cultural nationalist. He didn't really believe in Chicano power, but he did believe it was important. He believed to be, you know, prideful in Mexican heritage, and he used that to draw people in. But then the point was to say, look, we're not in Mexico anymore. We need to learn how things work here so that then we can defend ourselves and protect our interests. And so that sort of training takes work. And so part of the idea, I think, is that he would have been, for instance, kind of disturbed by what we saw last year in 2006, not because of the size of the demonstrations, but because perhaps afterwards there wasn't a lot of political education going on, trying to figure out how do we get these people into channels of power to understand that they can make a difference. And that simply taking to the streets is a form of power, but in the absence of a whole lot of other political organizing, that hard work of talking to people, of going door to door, of precinct walking, and all that kind of stuff that Chavez was really about, in the absence of that, there is no power. So I think it was very strategic on his part to sort of draw that constituency in and then turn them into the kinds of political agents that Hansen and Huntington say that Mexicans are culturally unable to do, right, because of our core cultural traits of laziness and lack of ambition and all these kinds of things. I think that part of it was to create this kind of counter narrative, as you're pointing it out, or simply to say, look, we're not like that. In fact, we can play this game too, and if you really take us off enough, we'll show you how much we can do this. And I think that what really the model should have been is to learn from what happened after the passing of Proposition 187 in California, where many Latinos realized that they were going to be attacked by anti-immigrant forces led by Governor Wilson if they didn't mobilize. And what you saw there was this huge swing in naturalization rates, people becoming mobilized. And the result after that was that Republicans were virtually eliminated from every state office in California because of these new citizens that came in. And it wasn't until Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor that a Republican had any high office in California at all, largely because of the backlash of what happened after Proposition 187. So I think that Chavez was very much about showing that you know, there was an alternative that could be gotten out of Mexican folk culture that could provide a real alternative, but it was to try to provide a sense of what that real alternative can accomplish, the alternative with power. Non-violent power, of course, but power.
I don't argue with the elements that you're presenting on nonviolence in terms of practices and so forth, but I think the idea that if you were to try and sell it to the American people in terms of cloaking it in Latin Catholicism, I think you'll have a very tough sell, because I think that brings a substantial amount of different types of baggage with it. And if you also then present the image of the penitents, that image will not particularly sell in American society, no more than when we see the news with the Iranians or the Iraqis flogging themselves on the back in penitence, because those are the types of images that would be presented. So I think you have to be very careful about the type of images that you would present in terms of selling these elements.
You know, the question is that, you know, perhaps the strong core of Mexican Catholicism that was part of La Causa wouldn't really sell very well to a mainstream sort of American audience. I don't know, I wonder sometimes. I mean, of course, I think we have to be creative about this. I think that's part of the real fun. Let me just say this, I'm the director of the Peace Studies program at Oregon State University, so I teach classes in nonviolence theory, particularly the work of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Cesar Chavez. And what's fun about this kind of work and reading these kinds of people is because how actively they forefront the idea of using our imagination to try to deal with our lives. The fact that all of these speakers always say, just because something has been done this way for centuries and for generations of tradition doesn't mean that it has to be done this way if we think about it and we work together as collaborative forces. And so there's this real sort of positive energy that nonviolent philosophy brings, thinking about imaginative ways that we can change the way we live and work together. And so I think, yes, I think that, you know, this message of the logic of nonviolence for La Causa is directed mostly towards a Mexican and Mexican-American audience at the time. But I think that, you know, if we put ourselves to it, we can probably find points of overlap that can work, that can energize American social justice struggles. We have a very long tradition going back to, you know, the Puritans, of people who resist what they consider to be injustice, that fight back, that try to think of new ways to organize our social life. And in some sense, you know, I think Americans, even though the suffering ideal is very sort of Mexican, I think Americans like to suffer a lot. Why else do we work so much? Why else do we sit in the office for 40, 50 hours a week, delaying gratification, right? And we go on vacation maybe once, 2 weeks a year, if at that, if we don't have this idea that we're working for something better. I think the American work ethic is an idea of sacrifice, right? Sacrifice for some greater good, whether you believe it in the Protestant sense of going to heaven or just so that you can afford an RV or your timeshare. I think we all have this kind of sense that sometimes we really need to work hard and we need to give a little bit in order to be with one another. And there's a strong current against that, right? To sort of pull up by your bootstraps and, you know, this is all done for myself. But I think that we sometimes think about Mexican culture and American culture in too many one-dimensional ways and really fail to see the rich resources we have for thinking in different ways. And I think that what's important about Cesar Chavez here is he's saying, look, what many people think about Mexico is that it's this place of corruption, of greed, of violence. And I want to show you that it's not, that there's an alternative way of looking at what Mexico has to offer that maybe can teach the United States about nonviolence. And I think that's something that perhaps even Mexicans and Chicanos in the United States need to learn is how not to stereotype gringos and gabachos, right, white people, to think of them as all, and this was a big tendency during the Chicano Civil Rights Movement, is to think of all white people in this way. All white people are like this. I think this kind of discourse is really unproductive anymore. I think we really need to figure out the different ways in which we can draw on rich resources in our history. And so part of it is we need to understand our history really well. And I think that we don't do a good job of that, to really draw on these kinds of resources to figure out how our future is going to be. Let's see.
I'm wondering if you can point to any examples of strategies that police have employed, like on a national and or local level, that deepen stuff like the internalized racism and oppression within groups and communities. So I don't know if that makes sense, but kind of like how can we do our own work with our own
Right, so the question is how are there models for ways of thinking about internalized oppression that people of color or minority groups in the United States have? How do we work on our own issues? I think that this is very important work, and I think that there needs to be space for different kinds of literally spaces in public institutions that allow groups to come together to be able to do work just for themselves. So if I was going to say a model, here's a model for a public institution. I don't know how CU Denver does this, but at Oregon State University, the university made a compact with various cultural centers, I guess about 10 years ago. So we have a system of different cultural centers, and I'm on the advisory board of the Cesar Chavez Cultural Center for Latino students on campus, but we have an African American one, and so we have these cultural centers, and they're not just program offices, but they're their own buildings and institutions. They're run entirely by students. Students train one another in terms of running the office, and they have elections, and it's overseen by the Office of Student Life to some extent, but it's not managed or programmed by them. And in these offices, they're meant to be sort of public spaces to honor the culture and traditions of these various groups on campus. And so there's this constant space where students can gather together with people who, quote unquote, are like them, like themselves, and they can engage in various kinds of cultural activities and learn a little bit about their heritage and their culture. But these things are open for everyone on campus, so anyone can come, and so they're explicitly, they can't be exclusive. And OSU has made a compact that these cultural centers, regardless of the budget situation in the university, will exist in perpetuity for OSU. The idea being that no matter how, we're never going to say, well, we need to slash this budget item, and so the cultural centers are going to have to go. And I think the idea of these cultural centers is not to create separate enclaves, but sometimes to provide people with the opportunity to learn a little bit about where they come from, so that then that gives them the background so that they can then go on furthermore into American public life. And so I think that our cultural centers are not, these kinds of separatist enclaves, and I think that that's a danger that can happen, is where people start to think, well, we're being besieged and battled. But I think it's really different at OSU when the institution has made that commitment that they'll always be there, so they're never going to be out of threat, and that means that they're part of the mission of the university to help educate everyone about that particular culture, and also those people from that heritage in their own culture. Because we shouldn't assume that all Latinos know what it means to be Latino, if there even is such a thing. Right? But these are all processes of constant learning, of figuring out tradition, of history. And so I think that there's a certain kind of model, different way of building sort of public spaces in our public institutions that are ways of kind of injecting pipeline ideas, of injecting people into public life so that they learn how to deal with their own issues, learn their own history, but also realize that they're part of a much greater project, which is the university, and then ultimately American public life. And so I think that there are ways you can construct these kinds of things that can deal with both of these issues, but that don't result in kind of, sell-out kinds of mentalities or ethnocentric separatisms. So I don't know, I hope that addresses the question. Yes, Becca?
I didn't come in doing any research, but my memory and my understanding was that Cesar Chavez was to a degree anti-immigration, because what he was trying to do was to get the farm workers' price up, and immigrants would come in and they would undercut his union members, and that he did not want them coming in because it was defeating what his purpose was.
That's true, but I think we need to be careful. I mean, a lot of different groups around the country have sort of tried to gain some momentum out of what was a very sort of specific historical condition, that he wasn't against Mexican immigration because he was against Mexicans or he was against immigration. What he was concerned about because of immigration was because he knew that California agribusiness exploited these people and used them to, and politicians used them too, to make sure that unions couldn't gain any power and that corporate businesses would be able to use cheap labor in various ways. And so his concern was not necessarily that the immigrants were coming and cutting down farm worker wages, but that he was worried, that was part of it, but part of it was that he knew that if these people kept coming, they were going to be used because there was an institutional system that would use them. And so he was against immigrant labor coming in because he felt that this was feeding a very unjust system, the system of corrupt conservative politicians and corporate leaders who rely on these kinds of people in order to maintain their power and their economic stability. And in that kind of a situation, he was against immigration. But I think that we need to understand that that was a very sort of specific kind of response that he had at the time, and not sort of a general view that Mexican immigration is going to undercut the economy or something like that in general, which is the way that it's usually used nowadays when we talk about Cesar Chavez and his anti-immigrant sort of sentiment.
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to very, very concretely about the relationship between Latinos and African Americans as ethnic political blocs, economic and political blocs. Because what the version that we get in the media these days is that there is this tension, there is this conflict, it's emerging, it's dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I was interested in your talk is the way that you sort of begin by saying that here's a problem with Chavez's thinking, that it's not integrationist enough in some ways. That his hope is ultimately some sort of ethnic autonomy or some sense. But then you finish by saying that there is this kind of some vision there ultimately of a global, international, class-based solidarity between groups. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between African Americans and Latinos currently, and specifically in relation to Chavez and this sense that he's drawing on cultural symbols from Mexican folk culture, whether that's going to ultimately appeal to a group like African Americans.
Well, I think, the relationship of African Americans and Latinos in the United States is very complicated, and it's quite devastating in some areas. I mean, you hear the past couple of years about renewed gang rivalries between African American and Latino gangs, for instance, in Los Angeles. And I think ever since 1992 with the Los Angeles riots, we've really been focused a lot on Black and Latino confrontations. And especially after the 2000 census, when it was revealed that Latinos had probably surpassed African Americans as the largest non-white group in the United States, there was a whole sort of discussion about what does it mean for Latinos to take over or overcome African Americans as this kind of group in the United States, even demographically. So I think that there's a lot of different dimensions to this kind of tension. But I think that what Cesar Chavez understood was that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was an important watershed moment for our country. It really did change things, largely because, well, it changed institutionally and politically to some extent, but really what it changed was this sense of African Americans realizing that they no longer had to be subjugated as a people, that they could stand up and actually take control of their lives if they wanted to. And so Dr. King has this entire sort of, in his early career, has this entire sort of discussion about what it means to be the new Negro, right? This new sort of person who doesn't have to take it anymore. And what he was interested in, Dr. King, that is trying to figure out ways in which that spirit, how could we educate people? How could we go out into the communities, into the urban areas, and mobilize people to realize that power is something that is built when people come together and talk about how they want their lives to live. That power is not a kind of an ability or a kind of quantum that only certain people have, and that if some people have it, other people can't have it, right? Power is not that kind of a limited resource. Power is something that can be created sort of ex nihilo, out of nothing, if people can come together to think about it. And so Chavez was very indebted, he thought, to Martin Luther King. In fact, he said, look, most of what we learned was from them, right, from African Americans. And early on you started to see that, look, the tactics and the traditions of nonviolent struggle have really been brought to a much higher level by the African American civil rights movement. We need to learn from them. So like I said, with the pilgrimage movement, the idea of the pilgrimage to Sacramento, that was sort of part of that Mexican Catholicism, that folk culture. But as I said, during it, there would be political education that was modeled on some of the things that went on in the freedom schools in Tennessee, right? How do we educate people to be citizens? And so there were organizers from SCLC and SNCC and all these people coming and being sort of intellectual guardians in some sense for Cesar Chavez and trying to provide sort of a foundation for what could be possible there. And so I think that we need also, this is going back to this idea of history, I think that if we can really sort of see the ways in which African Americans and Latinos have worked together, and have worked together in Latin America, where there's a very different sort of racial model of what it means to be a colored person, that perhaps in fact that the Latino sensibility of race which is much different than the American sort of, one-drop rule kind of thing. If that kind of thing can suffuse into our culture even more, that would even be more beneficial, because we start to see that it's not just a white and a black world, but there's all sorts of shades in the middle. And once you start to sort of dissolve that distinction of white and black and start to see these kinds of gradations, that allows you to begin to talking about all the different kinds of ways that you can build coalitions, that you can talk about shared issues, that you can talk about what it takes really to take power in this kind of Hannah Arendtian sense, right, where power is not this thing that someone has, but it's something that we build together when we can fight to accomplish something that we as a community have agreed that we want. And so I think that that's the kind of struggle, is to figure out how do we build these kinds of communities of struggle together that are based in our history and tradition, and realizing that we have fought and we have built so much more together in the past than we might realize, and that this history can sustain us into the future. And so I think that that takes a bit of education. It takes making sure that we understand that it's important that we have elders in our movement, right? That we honor the wisdom and the memory of these people, but also understand that that can get staid and old after a while, and that so there needs to be innovation and imagination at the same time. And this really takes, again, I want to emphasize this idea of imagination, realizing that the way that we do this now is a response to various kinds of cultural conditions that we've undergone. And the democracy that we have was a response to certain kinds of problems that we confronted. But right, the pragmatists in the room, right, American philosophers, should recognize this, that really what we should be thinking about is how do we think in ways that respond to the issues that we need to deal with today, and realizing the way we did things in the past isn't always the best way to do things now.
Maybe one more question.
First of all, I'd like to say I'm very appreciative to you for your speech. And one of the questions that I have is that it's related to double language standard. And we've been experiencing a growing wave of double language usage. And by doing so, according to me, it's my opinion, we split society in two groups, Latina and non-Latina. And you said that by doing so, we simply encourage this, split in our society. And this idea of self-punishment doesn't hold true in this particular situation, as you said. And the presence of an incentive of not learning English pulls apart the groups. So I see inconsistency in this whole idea of unity. How would you respond to this idea? Why do we encourage people to speak two languages? Why do we encourage them not to learn English?
Well, the way I would respond to that is I think that the picture that you portrayed is wrong. What I said is that the worry that many neo-nativists have is that we are splitting along these kinds of ethno-linguistic ways, and it's simply not true. If you look at, there's a great study that comes out every once in a while called Immigrants in the United States that talks about linguistic usage. And as I pointed out, according to these studies, the longer that people are here, the more they assimilate into English. And so it's not the case that Latinos are actually not wanting to learn English. In fact, the longer that they're here and their families are here, the more that they become English dominant. So it's not the case that places that there are strong nationalists who are saying, look, we need to not learn English. In fact, the more you're here, the more communities actually start to become English speaking and become assimilated to American ways. I mean, my family has been here about 100 years or so. I go back to Mexico. And first of all, I don't have any family in Mexico anymore. I go there. People never ask me, what part of Mexico you're from. They ask me, where are you from? Because you're certainly not Mexican. Right? And so the idea that Latinos in the United States are just like the people in Latin America and have the same kinds of linguistic traits and cultural traits is simply not true. So the more that people are here, the more they become like the mainstream. And I think that this idea that we're breaking up into Latino and Anglo-America based on linguistic models isn't borne out by the empirical evidence, I think. And the other thing is, I'm not sure exactly why we emphasize so much on being a monolinguistic society, as though language use represents everything about a person's worldview. I think that's a very sort of narrow kind of perspective, and I think it's been discredited in linguistics even, the idea that if you only speak one language, you only see the world in one way. So I think that, the worry about, if we don't speak English, we're not going to see things in a certain kind of way, follows a very sort of Worfian, Superian kind of view of language that many people don't believe anymore. And I think it really sort of says, it kind of doesn't give credit to people's ability to be imaginative and creative about how they see their world based on the language they speak. And there are many places in the world where it's multilingual and they get along fine, right? And they are able to accomplish things. And these are societies that are liberty-loving. They believe in liberal representative democracy, and they believe in market economies. So the idea that being a multilingual society is somehow going to decay our cultural values, which I think is really something that we should try to maintain to some extent. I think that none of the empirical evidence supports it, and there's no real sort of model to show where things like this break down. If a society divides based on linguistics, there's usually other things going on, right? If you look at the former, Yugoslavia, it wasn't the fact that there were different languages going on, but there's much other sorts of social problems going on, and people sort of focus on language as sort of a representative for these kinds of problems, but that, I think, is a really bad social science.
I wish I could agree with you, but when you call, for example, to your bank, and you've got two options for English standalone, for Spanish press too. It's everywhere. You see documents in two languages. So I wish I could believe you that, double standard language, double standard, leads to greater variety. And because I myself speak different language, but when I came to this country, I decided to segregate myself from Russian community, which I came from, right? Why? Because I left Russia not just to come here and implement my Russian ideas here. I came here to learn something new, to prove myself that I can do something. And when I came here, I knew only a few words, yes and no, and goodbye, right? So I decided to learn something new. And of course, your idea of implementing a few languages into society is great, because I experienced this benefit on myself. But by doing so, you discourage other people, in participating. Why don't we implement another language? Why don't we create another language in documents? For example, you see an application for a job, you see an application for a loan, double language. Why is that so? This is a question that really, touches me. And you see, I'm not an American. I'm not Latino, I'm something different. But I came to this country not to show that I'm different. Yes, I am, but it's inside of me. I'm not trying to implement Russian language in this society, because I think it will be not fair. This country is made of many cultures. And what if all of us, start implementing our own languages?
Well, I think you should look to the history of Russian immigrants in this country, and you realize that in many urban areas, Russian immigrants did fight for having Russian language newspapers, Russian language organizations in their different societies. And so, as you point out, you point out that you want to say that you're different from here, what this is inside here. And I would say maybe you're not. Actually, because Russian immigrants have a deep history in terms of the ways that they've changed American cities. Their presence has affected the sort of cultural makeup of many different places in the United States. That's part of the history of the United States. And so to that extent, you're not different from who we are. You're not that.
Of course, I'm becoming part of it. I don't deny that.
Okay, this sounds like a very interesting dialogue, but for reasons of time, we have to stop. Thank you all for coming, and can you please thank you.
I don't know. I know I'm Maria Mayer. She's trying to get prepped for her class, but I don't know if.
Okay.
So should I talk to Myra and Kim?
Sure, at least Kim.